So this book started long ago and far away from me. I was a sustainable transport advocate in a place called Nova Scotia, Canada. And I had the opportunity to go to Kazakhstan. And as I was in Kazakhstan, I didn't know how to pronounce Kazakhstan. That's where I was at in terms of my relationship with Kazakhstan. And while I was in Kazakhstan, I learned that there are all these relationships between Canada and Kazakhstan. For example, oil, mainly. So both are major oil exporters, and the former Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Chrétien, sat on the board of Petro Kazakhstan. And there were ongoing knowledge exchanges between universities in terms of training in oil working. And as I was reflecting on this and the fact that I myself had flown halfway around the world for this particular experience, something was happening back home in Canada. And this is home, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And this is Hurricane Juan, which hit in 2003. And you can see it was a big storm, almost as big as Nova Scotia itself. So today I'm going to tell you a bit about the impacts of Hurricane Juan, as well as Hurricane Igor, which hit a nearby region in 2010. As well as responses and key concepts that emerged from my research. These are recent storms that have hit Atlantic Canada, and there's a sense of increased severity of storm weather events. So Hurricane Juan hit Nova Scotia, also known as Mi'kma'ki, in 2003, and Hurricane Igor hit Newfoundland and Labrador, known as Katahdin, in 2010. I conducted interviews with policymakers, transport managers, policy documents, analyzed policy documents, read media coverage before, during, and after these events, and as well, very interestingly, looked at legislative transcripts. How were these events discussed by the powers that be? Before I proceed any further, I'll acknowledge that my research took place on unceded Indigenous territory. Nova Scotia is also known as Mi'kma'ki, and it's the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And the part of Newfoundland that I was studying on are the unceded territories of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq, known as Katahdin. And I love this photo because here we have two men who identify as Indigenous, and they have built a birch bark canoe using ancient technologies. But on the front, they have a GoPro, because who doesn't have a GoPro? And so it's kind of a capturing of the old and the new. And the comments about how the traditional cues for knowing when the birch bark was ready to harvest are changing. It used to be when the fireflies came out in June, but those cycles are changing. The texture of the birch bark itself is changing with climate change. So these ancestral practices they're trying to sustain them, but also keep up with ongoing changes. So impacts, part 1 of 3. So the parts of the world I'm talking about are very used to storms. These are coastal regions that are acclimatized to storms. But both of these storms that I'm focusing on today exceeded expectations. So this is a coastal fishing village in Nova Scotia, and the fishing vessel itself has sunk, notably, indicating the severity of the storm. Hurricane Juan was defined by high winds and a massive storm surge, about 3 meters. Other mobility impacts, so there were massive falls of trees and power poles and power lines, which blocked streets and roads. For some, a select few, this was quite fun for a little bit, a bit of a playground atmosphere. But for most, if you, for example, someone living, this is a residential street, if you had to get an ambulance onto this street, or if you had to evacuate someone, it's extremely difficult. Other mobility impacts included impacts on rail infrastructure. So the storm surge action was so severe that it actually caused oil tankers to tumble into the harbor. And the wave action was so severe that this ship would have banged against infrastructure, causing it to crumble, essentially. As one emergency manager noted, The scale of the devastation was almost unimaginable. We're dealing with loss of critical infrastructure because the trees were down, you couldn't get fire trucks or police cars or ambulances down certain streets. Hurricane Igor was defined by flooding, massive road and bridge washouts. Newfoundland has a very peninsular geography, and often there is just one road connecting communities. If that road goes, that community is disconnected. So this is the scale of road and bridge washouts that we're talking about. This is not minor. This is not patchwork overnight repair. There were road and bridge washouts in such a large region that it isolated more than 100 communities for up to 10 days each. And I'll invite you just to take a moment to think, if you were a political leader in this region faced with this scale of damage, how might you overcome that? If you lived in this community and you had a loved one over here who is a bit more vulnerable, what might that, how might that make you feel, or what actions might it spur? So I'll just let you throw that thought there. One journalist wrote, "I never imagined life without a highway. That's how integral the highway is here." This is not Manchester. No connection between communities. The 35-kilometer route that I took every day to get to work was practically obliterated. Guardrails hung like slack clotheslines across huge gaps, and asphalt was ripped like paper. In my book, I draw on different voices, and one of the voices I draw on is a poet from my part of the world, Sue Goyette. And she writes, "We realized then that we lived on a peninsula, and the rocking for water surrounding us was actually the ocean slurping, giving the sense that those on land are actually a bit of an oyster shell that's being enjoyed by an oyster, and an oyster shell being enjoyed by the ocean itself." And what I incorporate Goyette throughout my book, but the idea, I really like how she helps reconceptualize the power dynamic between the social and the ecological. So here, the ocean is dominant rather than society acting upon the ocean. Oops. Okay, so that was part one. Moving on to part two, responses. So how was mobility adaptive before, during, and after these severe weather events? So in Nova Scotia, we are a coastal area, so it's a common expression and a common set of knowledge to batten down the hatches. This means if you have lawn chairs outside, you are going to tuck those away so they don't act as a projectile during a storm. It means mooring ships out at sea so they don't crash into infrastructure, damaging the ship and infrastructure. It also means, and this is a trend that has emerged just in the past few decades or so, I think, indicating another proxy for climate change, which is the concept of storm chips. Chips are crisps in Canada, and the idea that before a given storm lands, you want to have your salt and vinegar crisps on hand because you don't want to be stuck without. But the fact that this is, there's a commonly before storms, there'll be a reminder to go and get your storm crisps. So there's a sense of battening down the hatches. As the storm hits, people are encouraged to stay at home and off the roads. But for some, they cannot resist the temptation of going down to the waterfront. This is a sculpture of a wave that looks suspiciously like a tongue. And they want to feel the full force. They want to be able to lean into the wind and feel the wind support them. And so there's a charismatic mobility that's taking place here. Whereas other people find the charisma of their salt and vinegar crisps much more charismatic. Staying in. Oop, I'm really having trouble with that. After the storm had passed, there are a theme emerged was called arboreal and electrical entanglements. Is it possible to move the Zoom so it doesn't block the headlines? Oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, that seems very dramatic. I think we're just going to roll on. We're going to roll on. And essentially, trees are existing along with power poles, and they all went down, not all, but they went down and were entangled with one another. And this required, so this is social ecological entanglement. This is kind of what I'm talking about, but the messy, chaotic version of it. We want to see integration of the social and ecological, but not like this. So this required crews, electrical crews coming from all parts of Nova Scotia, from eastern seaboard, from across Canada to come and disentangle tree by tree the power wires, the electrical grid from the trees. This is not fast work. Something like 1 million trees fell in the province during this storm. This is Hurricane 1. Felt like there was something else I wanted to say about that, but I think it escaped me. And in Newfoundland, particularly in Newfoundland, these alternate or shadow mobility networks emerged. So the main roads, as you saw before, were washed out, gone. So how do you get from here to there? What does that look like? This entails healthcare, getting people to getting insulin into a community, getting someone to a chemotherapy appointment, getting people to their part-time precarious employment, and more. And what emerged in Newfoundland were all these different ways of getting around, aside from the dominant automobile emerged. So one big one was what are called quads, or off-highway vehicles. So there are people with the knowledge, the equipment of how to operate this, but they also understand the land and where they can go on this machinery. People used little tiny boats. They seconded ferries to different parts of the region. They used helicopters. People hiked to get infant formula. All these different ways of being mobile and enabling social interactions occurred. Most of those modes, however, that I just mentioned are all fossil fueled. So they get away from the car, but not from fossil fuels themselves. So in both Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, more miles, more smiles. I hope we're appreciating this. There may be gas, petrol on a given site at a petrol station, but with no electricity, the power grid is down, the pump does not work. Okay? Or if the pump works, it's one of the few ones that works, then there's a run on this particular station, and there was a lineup of cars getting fuel to the point where they then ran out of fuel. So they're indicating the tightly coupled systems of electricity and fossil fuel or petrol distribution. These are a couple of the final responses from communities. Was in one breath, we've never seen anything like this before in our lives. And in the next breath, let's get back to normal as soon as possible. And this is, you hear it all the time, a common narrative and a common human instinct that when you experience this level of disruption, that you want to get back to what felt safe and secure just hours or days ago. Even though this is reinstating the fossil fueled systems that exacerbated climate change and led to this severe weather that led to this infrastructure and societal disruption. I know I didn't say earlier, but in Newfoundland, the average stream flow increased from something like 10 cubic meters per second to 600 cubic meters per second. Another response was this 10-day recovery narrative in Newfoundland, One provincial politician, he said, we hauled contractors off the West Coast, we hauled them off the East Coast. They all came together and it went like clockwork, bang, bang, bang. We knew all the gaps. And the government here very much viewed their responsibility as putting the road network back together. Once that was done, that was it. Good job. And on we go again. It was not seized as an opportunity for discussions about public safety, about aging populations, about climate change. It was very much an infrastructural, let's put things back together. And yes, this was different from what happened in Nova Scotia, interestingly. Does anyone know what this is an image of? Any historians in the room? This is Halifax, Nova Scotia, circa 1917. This is the largest human-made explosion prior to World War II. And this was invoked by research participants a number of times to speak to the scale of the devastation wrought first by the explosion and then by Hurricane Juan, particularly with regard to the treescape. So in Nova Scotia, there was this sense that Hurricane Juan was one of many disasters broadly and weather disasters specifically that had impacted the region. And it was part of a narrative that we need saying, okay, well, we had that one and then we had that one. We really need to start doing things differently. Whereas in Newfoundland, for reasons we could get into, it was an isolated one-off. That was the perception or the handling of it. All right, moving on. So we've done impacts, we've done responses. Now we're moving towards concepts. And again, with these severe weather events, I'm thinking about social ecological relationships. How do we change these in a time of climate crisis? Poet Sue Goyette writes, and what a hurricane of a question, what a tidal wave of disruption. It got worse when we walked into it, the ocean, and let it taste us. When we wrote our names in the soft sand of its back, we didn't know the first thing about commitment or about being out of our depths. And this is very much a sense that I was struck by in my research, and that research participants conveyed directly, is that here I am, a transport manager in Newfoundland, and I am responsible for this stretch of road. And I cannot build it. There is not the budget to build it to the flood standard that's required. And so they're kind of the sense of being out of our depths. What are we to do? And so I'm moving to some concepts that I hope will be useful in this regard. So 2 concepts. The first is an ecological approach to mobilities. So this starts from traditional transport planning. Car is king. Roads are all about speed and volume, getting wherever it is as fast as you can and accommodating as much demand. And then I trace this evolution to sustainable transport planning. So the idea of reducing the environmental impact of mobility and enjoying creating livable spaces. And then as another iteration, I'm adding to this an ecological approach to mobilities, looking at not only the movements of humans, but ecological movements. So more than human approaches. So how does stormwater need to move? How might trees fall? How can we accommodate them? What does an ecological approach to a street, a road, a region, air travel and beyond, what does that encompass? So this is one of my favorite tables. I have a favorite table in the book, and this is an extract from it. So you can see transport planning, street as road, to sustainable transport, street as space, to an ecological approach where the street is an ecological entity. And there are many more of these in the book, but for example, in transport planning, it's all about forecasting traffic demand, forecasting and accommodating. Sustainable transport, more about visioning communities. and an ecological approach being more transformative. So I think an ecological approach applied in communities can help prepare for severe weather events by thinking before an event hits, how will we accommodate floodwater? How will we accommodate a drought? How can we create our environments so that they work for humans and for ecosystems, including animals? The second concept, I'm going to take a surreptitious look at my watch, we are on time, is weather routing, climate routing, pardon me. So I had a conversation with a mariner in Newfoundland, and he talked quite poetically about how when they are in their ship, they are, he says, we'll weather route to allow us to maintain the maximum speed with the minimum amount of energy. Now this is all about maximizing profit and decreasing time in traveling. But the way he described it was the continual interface or attunement between the captain of the ship, between currents, waves, tides, and more. And so that the course of the ship is continuously being attuned. And I thought, my goodness, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could take this attunement and apply it to a climate, thinking about climate. These, for those not in the know, are trajectories from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so how can we bend down trajectories with this kind of attunement? And I have a few ideas. These are not exhaustive. The first is revolutionizing mobility. That's all, just a minor revolutionize mobility. But what became apparent in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland is that mobility, fossil-fueled mobility currently, is built into the DNA of everything. So you want to go to a health appointment, a medical appointment, you want to get to school, if you want to get to a job, there's most often fossil-fueled mobility behind there. So how do we reconceptualize our relationship with mobility? Part of this includes prioritizing what I call vital mobilities. So this is an image from Newfoundland and an NGO representative. She said, simply, we needed to get supplies from here to there. They know what they're doing. They've pre-positioned supplies like bottled water and cots. But there are things like insulin, methadone, and other medications that need to get from here to there. Well, how do you make that happen when there are these prolonged and numerous road washouts? How can we prioritize vital mobilities in the face of disruption? A third approach is embracing green and blue. And this is about creating that attunement. How can we as humans, particularly academic humans perhaps, be more attuned to the broader environment? So for example, this is a smart fin. Anyone smart finny here? No? So on your surfboard, you can collect data about water temperature and carbon levels. And this could be applied to other vessels so that you have your day of surfing or your day of kayaking, but you're also a little bit of citizen science, collecting data and getting to know your particular part of the world in a more intimate way that might allow you to advocate for it when it comes to discussions about building the next road or what have you. This is one of my favorite quotes, rebranding redundancy. This is from a Newfoundlander who reflected on Hurricane Igor. He tied his barbecue down in the spirit of battening down the hatches, but he forgot to tie the house down. And in Storm Fiona, Hurricane Fiona, which hit just this past year, I saw a home. Someone had literally put straps over the whole house to keep that roof on. They had been burned the last time, and it was not going to happen again if they could help it. So rebranding redundancy. So there's been a push in this part of the world and other parts of the world to streamline, reduce redundancies, create efficiencies. This can be tied with austerity pushes. But the idea is, okay, well, what's the backup plan? What happens when the ambulance can't make it to your house? What happens when you can't get that insulin supply? what's the backup plan? And thinking about that more as communities. And as part of this, in Newfoundland, does anyone know what this is? I'm just curious about cultural knowledge. Is it a root? What's that? Please speak up. Oh, kind of. This is that part of the world, so that's a very good guess. And actually, yeah, that's a good question. These are called root cellars. And so this is before refrigeration. This is how settlers stored their crops so that they would stay cooler in summer and warmer in winter, not freeze. So here we even have a redundancy. I think this particular community has 100 root cellars. So this was how to care for your food before there was electricity. And an idea that I think would be really useful in and of itself, but also this root cellar approach whereby each community not only has food stores, but how does this apply to decentralizing energy grids, to having localized healthcare professionals, pharmaceutical supply chains? What are the opportunities for rebranding, redundancy, and more? And finally, two last ones, thinking flex. Again, this is in line with rebranding, redundancy. If we can't do it the normal way, the usual way, what are our options? And these storms indicated that there were a plethora of options, still fossil fueled largely, but there are different ways of doing things. So how can we build this flexible thinking into our work? And finally, an ethic of care. So I attended COP26 in Glasgow on behalf of HCRI, and COPs are not my favorite thing. I'm just going to say it. They're not my favorite thing. But I had a wonderful moment where I was taking the train on a very foggy Thursday morning, and there was our train passed a stop without stopping. And on the platform, there were about 8 red rebels standing in a line, holding hands, dressed in red, with the white face makeup. And I saw them for a millisecond, but the mood, the tone of their approach, and the fact that they were holding hands really struck. It resonated with the mood of the whole COP for me. And while COP was happening, another storm was hitting back home. And this is, let's just show you a little clip. This is an unnamed storm, but another road washout. And in contrast to COP, here are how locals are navigating this disruption. I think see what we can do here. Come on, you can do it.
Tie the end of the green rope to your post or something like that. I have a cleat from a boat. No, like one that you mount on the thing. Yeah, I have one in the shop I can bring you. You can mount on that pole. Yeah, okay.
Jesus, I hit a spotter.
All right, well, I'm going to pull it back.
I'm going to leave it there, but that's a community, one community that's been cut off, and they have rigged up, someone has a long rope, they rigged up the rope, and they are using a milk crate to transport food, bread and milk to the people who are isolated. And the modesty of this endeavor and the effort to kind of hold hands across this gap really struck me. And I think there's something here in terms of carrying forward in climate action. And with that, where are we? There. We've done impacts, we've done responses, we've done concepts, and that's everything. Thank you.